Perfect. Hello, everyone. Hello. My name is Rose. I am the community educator at Women's Advocates. Thank you all so much for being here today. And our topic for today is called Paths to Safety, Youth Advocacy. We're going to be diving into youth and what they kind of go through when they experience domestic violence and abuse, and what can we do as youth providers or just being around youth to kind of advocate for them and help them if they were ever in that situation. So yeah, you are able to take care of yourself however you may need during this webinar. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the chat. I will read them out loud and I will answer them as we go. But with that, as we begin, I want to just talk a little bit more about Women's Advocates as an organization. If you've been here before, you've seen our webinars, you know about us, you probably know about what we do and who we are. But if you are new here, welcome. Hello. Women's Advocates is a nonprofit organization located in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we just offer all sorts of safety help to victims, survivors of domestic violence. A lot of what we do involves what we are doing right now. So educating through webinars, presentations. We do a lot of outreach work where we go out into the public in order to reach people who may not know about us. We are a shelter, so we have homes for victim survivors and their children who may need a place to stay. And we also have great housing stability resources for children and families all alike for them to find safe housing after they leave our shelter. They are able to kind of find safe housing and be able to continue on their lives. But we began in the early 1970s as a legal advice helpline. And we were supporting women who were seeking divorce and legal name changes at the time because no-fault divorce was not a thing. And so a lot of the women who were seeking divorce at the time were doing so because they were going through abuse and domestic violence in their homes and they didn't know where to go. They couldn't turn to anybody. And so they would call a lot of these divorce legal advice helplines seeking divorce. And a lot of the women who were working this helpline at the time opened up their homes to a lot of these victim survivors of domestic violence and their children. And it became it was noticeable and everybody was like, well, this is not sustainable, right? We can't just open our homes up. We don't have enough space. The amount of women who were seeking divorce were just multiplying and adding up by the day. And so the first domestic violence shelter of the nation is us, Women's Advocates. They came together. A lot of these women came together and opened up their own shelter to shelter a lot of these women and kids. So it's been 50 years since we actually celebrated our 50th year this past month. And so, yeah, we're still here. We're still doing our thing. We're still helping. And hopefully we have another 50 years ahead of us to kind of do this work to try and stop the cycle of domestic violence. If you would like to know more about us, our org, what we offer, events, anything like that, I can add our website into the chat. Feel free to just visit us at womensadvocates.org and you will be updated with a lot of what we do. And so diving in now, what we will learn today, 3 parts to this webinar. So part 1, we will talk about the impacts of abuse towards youth. Part 2, prevention and awareness of abuse against youth. And then we will end it off with part 3, so how to center these young individuals and how we can kind of go at abuse when talking with them. How do we go at it from a trauma-informed approach? What does that look like and sound like? We will talk about it all. Perfect. Let's start with part 1, the impact of abuse towards youth. So when we talk about domestic violence on the screen, we have the power and control wheel for teens, so the teen power and control wheel. We have a power control wheel overall, but because we are talking about young individuals, we want to add the teen power and control wheel. And a lot of the things involved in this wheel are ranging from peer pressure, emotional abuse, sexual coercion, threats, um, and we have the definition of what domestic violence is overall on the screen. And it's a intentional 24/7 pattern of abuse ranging from physical, psychological threats, intimidation, isolation, or economic coercion used by an individual to exert power and control over another person. And there are many forms of abuse that goes beyond just physical abuse. And we'll continue to kind of dive deeper into that as we go. But keeping that in mind, this is what domestic violence is. And whether you are a youth, an adult, everybody can face domestic violence. But because we are focusing on youth today, we want to kind of remind everybody of what domestic violence is, but also showcase a different power and control wheel. So speaking of how domestic violence and abuse goes beyond just physical abuse, this slide shows all of the different types of abuse that can be perpetrated onto another person. Um, as you can see, there's a lot of them that goes, of course, beyond just abuse. And this doesn't mean that one is necessarily quote unquote better than the other. They are all bad because they fall under the umbrella of abuse, right? But when a lot of people talk about domestic violence and abuse, it's usually always about physical abuse. And if somebody isn't being physically harmed, then people tend to think that they are not in danger in any way. And we then want to do our part and educate and further emphasize the message that that is not true, that there are many forms to abuse and all of them can be equally as harmful. And we don't, of course, want to downplay any sort of abuse. And as you're looking on this screen, which ones kind of stand out to you? Which ones do you hear about often? And then which one have you not thought about where you think, hey, never thought that that could be abusive? Or maybe you've been here before, and maybe by doing what you do now, you know exactly what abuse may look like. But yeah, understanding that abuse goes beyond just the physical. And so quickly here, diving into youths and domestic violence, who exactly falls under the youth category? Because it feels like everyone has their own age range when they are talking about youths. You can do simple Google searches and different age groups will pop up. And so who exactly falls under youth? When we are talking about youth today, we are talking about people in the ages between 13 to 24. So when we use the word youth, or when I'm saying the word youth, it's around the age range of 13 to 24. Statistics, facts, everything will be taken from that age range. But yeah, just wanting to throw that out there very quickly, like, hey, this is who we're talking about. This is the target audience that we want to help out as of today. And so here we have some statistics about youth who experience abuse before turning 18. The numbers are high, and we know that if someone is past the age of 18, abuse can still very much continue. Under the age of 18, you experience abuse. Over the age of 18, you can still very much experience abuse. But if we're going to try and focus on specific statistics and just youth before the age of 18, 1 out of every 4 girls is sexually abused. 1 out of every 6 boys is sexually abused. 85% of children of child abuse, victims never report their abuse because a lot of people who are experiencing abuse, especially as younger individuals, oftentimes don't know who to turn to, don't have the resources to kind of speak up about this for. They don't know who to talk to. And so a lot of abuse cases go unreported, especially if you are a younger individual. 1 in 5 children are solicited sexually while on the internet. More than 90% of abusers are people children know, love, and trust. We often hear about the story of somebody driving up in the white creepy van and pulling you in. But a lot of times, or most of the time, abuse is happening to these victim survivors by somebody that they know, a family member, a friend, you name it. And an estimated 42 million survivors of childhood sexual abuse exist in America today. So again, numbers are high, and this is just talking about the age group before you turn 18. And we kind of want to remember that most cases do go unreported, yes, and especially if abuse is inflicted on a young individual who may not be able to speak up for themselves or defend themselves, especially children. Those numbers just stay high. And a lot of these numbers that you see on the screen are, of course, again, high, but a lot of cases go unreported. And so if we were able to kind of some way, somehow figure out 100% of all of these cases going unreported and those that are being reported, the numbers will skyrocket. And it's terrifying to think about, especially for um, those who are so young. We want to be able to protect them and be able to educate them and be able to let people know ways that they can help youth if they were to ever come across somebody who may need resources. So on this slide, we have the teen dating violence in the US. So 1 in 3 teens will experience physical, sexual, or emotional abuse from someone they're in a relationship with before becoming an adult. And an adult meaning over the age of 21. And we have as many as 69% of youth reporting victimization from teen dating violence. And it's also a fact that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth are at a higher risk for dating violence compared to heterosexual and cisgender youth. And this is important to think about because when working with youth, if you do work with any, if you have kids of your own, if you interact with children at all, where you work in your families, we understand that everyone has different needs. So we want to be able to cater to everyone's needs by knowing and understanding everyone's identity, but also thinking about why that is. Why is this community of people experiencing more domestic violence? And women ages 18 to 32 have a higher chance of being sexually assaulted. Sexual assaults and abuse tends to happen at a very young age. And again, we want to do our part to combat that, not inflicting abuse ourselves, not being the perpetrator, but also being able to stand up for those who may not be able to stand up for themselves because they are so young and there is a lot of lack in resources for them. So with abuse comes a lot of short and long-term negative outcomes, of course, because abuse can follow someone and be harmful towards them for the rest of their lives. And so when you are experiencing abuse at a very young age and you're not even an adult yet, it's just going to follow you throughout adulthood. And it's a lot to deal with, and there's a lot of negative and long-term outcomes with that. So the negative outcomes we have here are impacts on one's mental and psychological health, where one may experience suicidal ideation and attempts at suicide and psychiatric conditions and symptoms. Your physical health is, of course, harmed, and that's where there is an unhealthy body mass index and risky sexual behaviors. And the use and abuse of substances. A lot of this can include nicotine, alcohol, different substances, even from cocaine, heroin, prescription drugs, and physical victimization. Um, a lot of these people may be associated with the increased use of cigarettes and marijuana. We see this a lot with youths who have been going through abuse and domestic violence. And again, as they grow into adulthood, it just kind of progressively gets worse. It doesn't necessarily get better. And so in order to help that and to get better, we again want to do our parts as youth providers. And then last but definitely not least, we have victimization and perpetration. So this can involve intimate partners, pure aggression. It can involve family members, friends, those who inflict abuse, pain, and domestic violence upon you. Yeah, all part of short-term, long-term negative outcomes. Um, Again, one isn't necessarily better, quote unquote, better than the other. All of them are very much terrifying. And yeah, knowing where that's coming from, where it stems from, can help us as providers do a better job at our job. So when we are talking about abuse and youths, we cannot skip the abusive household. A lot of the abuse and domestic violence that youths face starts at home, unfortunately. So many young individuals witness abuse between their parents or caregivers. And there is a difference between experiencing abuse and being exposed to abuse. Maybe somebody isn't being harmed physically, emotionally, mentally, well, isn't physically harmed, excuse me. Um, they're not being physically harmed themselves, but they are seeing it happening in their household to those around them, mentally, emotionally, that can also cause a toll on them. And again, one isn't necessarily better than the other just because you aren't being abused or being physically abused in any way. Doesn't mean that it's not going to mentally and emotionally scar you. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go to the difference between experiencing abuse and being exposed to abuse. But a lot of children exposed to and experiencing abuse may develop serious emotional and behavioral problems. If you work with youth, it's important to look at concerning behaviors from parents and caregivers. And a lot of youth being abused is also tied to homelessness. Abuse and neglect at home is often the reason that youths end up homeless, and the experiences of abuse at home may increase the risks of being abused or becoming abusive in adolescent and adult relationships. So going just a little bit deeper into what I kind of was just talking about, experiences of abuse and exposure to abuse. When abuse is present in the home, youth can have direct experiences of abuse, whether that's physical, verbal, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, and or they can be exposed to abuse being inflicted upon another family member, such as a parent, another sibling, a cousin, etc. And many people tend to think that this is involved with kids. So many people tend to think that as long as kids or youths are not there to see the abuse, that they are okay, and that as long as they are not being physically harmed in any way, that it's all good, that they will forget about it, or that they will understand that um, it doesn't involve them. And that is something that we want to debunk because it can, again, be very much emotionally and mentally um, draining for the youth. And that, again, falls under the umbrella of domestic violence. We talked about a couple slides back how domestic violence isn't just physical abuse, mental, emotional abuse, being exposed to abuse or experiencing it can cause all of that as well and do a lot of harm in the long run. So knowing that experiences and exposure, there is a difference, but one isn't better than the other, and they are both equally as bad. And so when going through abuse at a young age, not being able to kind of turn to anybody, not knowing who to talk to, where to go, domestic violence can lead to trauma bonding. And trauma bonding occurs when a person experiencing abuse develops an unhealthy attachment to their abuser. And this can happen for various reasons, including threats, manipulation, controlling, gaslighting. And we see this a lot in the adults we work with too. But when you are younger and more impressionable, it's a lot easier for the perpetrator to kind of control you and manipulate you. So Again, not knowing where to go, the lack of resources, and feeling like you are stuck, and oftentimes, a lot of times, actually being stuck in this situation, you can easily form this trauma bonding response. And here are some signs of trauma bonding we have on the screen. So you kind of realize you don't like this person being the perpetrator, the abuser. Your relationship is built around guilt and shame. You're not sure you'd leave if the abuse were to increase, because a lot of times the threats would increase and it's a very scary time to leave. You are love bombed and then devalued. This is again something we see a lot in adults as well, but even in youth, love bombing happens to everybody. The cycle of domestic violence continues, and love bombing doesn't, not a permanent thing. You're being loved, you're being shown affection, and then the abuse happens all over again. And oftentimes you find that you are hypervigilant. You have to always watch your back. You always have to watch what you are saying, watch what you're wearing, watch where you're going, because this can escalate things, and the abusive person can very much become more abusive if you are not hypervigilant about your actions and what you say. And so being familiar with abuse, we want to emphasize the message that it's hard to process abuse when you're still going through it. When you're in the middle of still going through abuse, you don't know how to process it all. Yes, these PDF slides, all the way towards the end, I will leave them in the chat and you can get a slide to them. Even after this, I will send out emails to everybody, and you will all get PDF slides to this. You will get certificates if you stay till the end, everything of the sort. But thank you for asking. But yeah, it's hard to go through abuse, but when you are still in the middle of going through it, or to understand abuse when you are still in the middle of going through it, excuse me. And the example that I like to use when I kind of bring up this message is, when you are in an argument with somebody, and in the middle of it, it's heated, a lot is happening, a lot is being said, you're angry, emotions are high. And then afterwards, whether that's a day later, a week later, or just a couple hours later, you think back to it, you think back to this argument, and you think to yourself, oh, this is what I should have said, right? This is what I should have said to this. This should have been my answer to that. Oh, I should have said this, should have said that. And I hear this all the time. And sometimes it's kind of like a joke, sometimes it's real with people. But you think about that, and you think about how in the moment when things are heated, emotions are high, you're still in the middle of going through an argument. Um, you can't fully process it, which is why afterwards you think about it when you are able to fully then process it afterwards and go, hey, I should have said this, or maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have thought things through. Let your emotions get the best of you. And so when people don't necessarily understand why victim survivors don't just leave their abusive relationships, or why don't they report it, or why don't they do this, why don't they do that, a lot of times it's hard to understand and fully think clearly when you are still in the middle of going through an abusive relationship. And leaving an abusive situation and relationship can be harmful and terrifying, because leaving an abusive relationship is the hardest time for a victim survivor due to things possibly escalating. If you were to leave, the threats may increase. You don't know what type of harm will be afflicted against you. And maybe your friends and family, pets that you have, harm can be inflicted upon them. And so we always want to emphasize this message and let people know, like, hey, leaving an abusive relationship is not as easy as people make it seem. And it's hard to understand what's going on when you're still in the middle of going through it. And sometimes you need that moment to step away and process what's going on and to really think in order to clear your mind and think clearly. But a lot of times victim survivors don't even get the chance to do that. And so it's just harmful in a lot of ways. And abuse can happen in all types of relationships, whether that be romantic, intimate relationships, friendships, or family. all of it can fall under the umbrella of abuse. So now, a question for you all, question for the chat. Feel free to type your answers out in the chat or kind of just think out loud to yourself. What's a challenging problem you've faced working with youth going through abuse, if you've ever gone through something like that? Maybe you work in different organizations, working directly with youths. Maybe you just know people around, nieces, nephews, children, siblings even, um, who may be going through something like that, or you suspect they may be going through something like that. So what's a challenging problem you have faced if you have ever been in that situation? Feel free to, again, type that into the chat if you can. Read it out, say it out loud, think about it for a second. And if you were ever faced with this problem, what do you think would be challenging? Wanting help but unwilling to give enough detail to know how we can be helpful. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when you say unwilling to give enough details, are you saying the youth that you are working with are not giving enough details, or are you saying there's not enough resources? And if you're still typing in the chat, and if I move on to a different slide, please continue to type and post whatever your thoughts are. I would love to revisit and read it again, because just because I've moved on doesn't mean that you have to delete what you are saying. But yeah. Okay. Hesitant to trust and perhaps a little scared. Yes, absolutely. And that's a very normal response, right? When you are going through abuse and you're so young, and the adults in your lives are not the ones that are protecting you, that are caring for you, but instead the ones harming you. How are you supposed to trust other adults out there and strangers out there? Even if they work with you, it takes a lot to open up and to be able to talk about it. Um, yeah, for sure. Hmm. Yes, this is another really good one. They're afraid that the perpetrator might be arrested, so that they won't offer details of the abuse or the abuser. Um, Again, I guess working with youth or victim survivors of domestic violence and wanting what's best for them, sometimes it could be really challenging to help them if you don't know what you should say or do, and there's not enough details for you to kind of offer them that help, right? But that is something that we see a lot too, where a lot of cases go unreported, or people kind of don't want to talk about their abuse because they are scared that the perpetrator will be arrested. And again, for various reasons, um, where things may escalate. They don't know what's going to happen to them if they were to report these things, right? But also, we do webinars about this too in the past. If you'd like to check them out, it's all on our YouTube. Feel free to go and watch them. But we talk about like grief with abuse. And sometimes you still have a lot of love and care for this perpetrator and the abuser, even though they are being abusive towards you. And it's a complicated feeling, because trauma is complex. And we also want to just emphasize, like, hey, that's normal, but also what can we do then to help them further, even if it is very challenging. Thank you for bringing that up, because that um, is something that we are faced with all the time here at Women's Advocates. Hmm. Yep, they want to be around the perpetrator because they love them, rather than not being around them at all when it's apparent, or they are getting abused from. It is, yes. You all bring up good points. And I think from what everybody is saying so far, we all kind of understand, right, the challenges, a lot of similar challenges. But whether you are working with youth, or you are just surrounded by youth, sometimes with family members, maybe you're an educator, we all understand, right, why it's hard, and how it can be so complex. to try and offer these helps. Thank you all for typing in the chat. I always appreciate it. Um, Another question for you all. So how do you model healthy relationships and behaviors within your organization or within your relationships? Um, with your partner, you know, if you have kids, how do you model healthy relationships with your partner so that your kids can see this and think, hey, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. These are what healthy behaviors look like. If you work with youths, how do you model that in your organization, as an individual with your coworkers? You know, what do you teach them? What do you tell them? If you have an answer, feel free to leave it in the chat, or think about that for a second. If you don't want to leave it in the chat, give us a couple seconds. Even if there's not much to say, I will move on. Again, even if I do move on and you're still typing, please continue to do so. Um, but with that, let's jump into part two. So we know about the impacts of abuse. We know about those different statistics, but prevention and awareness of abuse against youth. Tongue twisters, sorry. But here we have something that we talk a lot about in a lot of our webinars here at Women's Advocates. Relationships exist on a spectrum. So one of the reasons why our understanding of domestic violence can be limited to only physical assault is because we aren't always brought up with the understanding that relationships and specific behaviors within a relationship exist on a spectrum. So a lot of these behaviors fall under the healthy, unhealthy, and abusive categories. And a lot of times when we talk about unhealthy and abusive relationships, there's a very thin line between the two, and it often gets blurred out, especially if you are not familiar or you are experiencing an unhealthy relationship or an abusive relationship, but you don't necessarily know which category it would fall under. And again, one isn't necessarily better than the other. If you are in an unhealthy relationship, there are issues there too that you need to work towards, right? But it's not quote unquote better because at least you're not in an abusive relationship. We don't want to have that mindset. We don't want to think that way. We do want to enforce healthy relationships. So if you do fall under the unhealthy and abusive relationships, there should be resources out there for you if you were to need it. But for a healthy relationship, it means that the both you and your partner are communicating, you're respectful, trusting, honest. There's equality between the two of you, enjoying personal time away from each other, and making mutual choices, have economic and financial partners. So you're not being financially abused in any way. But you enjoy being together, you enjoy being apart from one another, you're able to enjoy your own company, and just everything good of the sort that we want to enforce in a healthy relationship. And then we have the unhealthy relationship. What does that look like? So not communicating, being disrespectful, not trusting, being dishonest, trying to take control of a certain situation, only spending time together. This is oftentimes can fall under the unhealthy category that people tend to get confused with. If you're spending time together, that means you love this person, right? You want to be with them all the time. But now you have no time apart. You don't ever spend time by yourself. You don't spend time with your friends, your family. You tend to forget about all of these other relationships out there that exist for you, and you are only spending time with your partner. That can very much fall under the unhealthy category as well. Pressured into activities or unequal economically. And so if that is unhealthy, then what would fall under abusive? What would abusive relationships look like? So if you're not communicating in an unhealthy relationship, in an abusive relationship, you are communicating, but in a hurtful or threatening way. You often mistreat your partner, accusing the other of cheating when it's untrue, denying their actions are abusive, controlling, big one, and isolating your partners from others. So we have healthy relationships where you are able to spend time together, spend time apart, spend time with different people in your lives, friends, family members, form all sorts of healthy relationships. We have unhealthy relationship where you are with your partner all the time and you tend to forget about everybody else. And then we have abusive relationships. The difference is you are being isolated from a lot of the people that are in your lives. Even if you do want to hang out with them, you want to call them, you want to see them, you can't do that because your abusive partner is very much controlling and not willing to let you talk to them or see them. And you have every right to, of course, talk to your friends, right? See your family members, visit people you love. But it's hard when you are being isolated in an abusive relationship. So here we have red flags of physical and sexual abuse towards young individuals, whether that be kids or teens, again, within the ages of 13 to 24. But a lot of these are present and we see them in kids and teens. So unexplained injuries, age inappropriate sexual knowledge, pregnancy or STIs, usually blood in somebody's underwear, the child self-reports the abuse, or sexually acting out, things that are just not appropriate and not normal. We want to pay attention to these in order to know the red flags and then being able to know how we can approach this problem if we were to ever come across something like this. And here are signs that youths may be facing emotional abuse and neglect. So the first one we have physical and sexual abuse. This one is emotional abuse and neglect. So avoidance, regression, resource guarding is a big one. Poor hygiene, delayed development, loss of confidence, loss of interest, changes in performance. People pleasing is also a big one. Lack of medical care and unmet physical needs. And wanting to point out that sometimes people are just shy, right? Shy people exist. Sometimes people are just quiet. And so if they are a little bit avoidant, if they are just not a super outgoing, super confident person, that's totally fine. We still want to be able to be there for them. Let them be themselves. It doesn't automatically mean that they are being abused at home, but a lot of times when we see a lot of these red flags come together, we want to be able to know what to do, and we can raise suspicion as to why this is happening, what is happening at home, what is happening in their relationships, just everything of the sort. So throughout this webinar, a lot about the beginning stuff that I was talking about, I talked a lot about lack of resources. And the lack of resources is part of why it's so hard for youth to find help. They need safe housing and proper education on abuse. Sometimes they just need safe housing and proper education overall, but they can't even get that because they are going through abuse. Social workers and counselors are valuable contributors to the fight against domestic violence. And too often, the communities that most need them are often the ones that have no access to them. The environment around a young person plays a big role in the decisions that person will make. Again, if they are surrounded by healthy relationships and the people are mirroring healthy relationships, they'll get used to that. They see the world as a much safer place. They feel more trustworthy of those around them. But if they are being abused, especially in their household, everything kind of seems dangerous. They don't know who to trust. They don't know who to turn to. And so this plays a big part in their decision makings and who they are as a person. And this last one here is talking about alternative resources to help mediate violent social situations and guide people towards de-escalating, especially when calling 911 is not an option. A lot of you said so in the chat, pointing it out already. You're already one step ahead of me. But calling 911, getting the abuser, the perpetrator, whoever it may be, arrested, getting them in trouble. A lot of times people don't want that. They still very much love this person. They still very much don't want to see this person being harmed, even if this perpetrator or the abuser is inflicting harm on the victim survivor. So calling 911 might not be an option. A lot of times race and ethnicity plays into this. How do you call 911 and how are you supposed to trust police officers if a lot of times the system is working against you and not with you, right? And again, speaking into people's identity, whether that be race, ethnic backgrounds, sexuality, gender, we want to be able to know who they are, who they identify as, so we can then help them with better resources and different alternative ways. I would love to see more alternative resources for those who may need it, especially if 911 is not an option for them. And as I bring that up, I would like to know if anybody in here has any ideas of what these alternative resources may be. So, we have shelters like right now. We have counselors, therapists, social workers who are able to kind of help talk and navigate these with these youth. But when things are just escalating into something that is so much bigger, so much more terrifying, but calling 911 is not an option, what can we do? And I don't expect us to have all the answers on this 1 hour webinar today, but just kind of think about it to yourself or even throw it in the chat if you'd like. What are alternative resources we can offer? So we have teen dating, violence awareness and prevention month. It is a thing. It is February. Happens to be the month of Valentine, celebrating love. And so let's amplify our voices and experiences in relationships. Let's showcase what healthy relationships look like in order to better prevent and educate, and that can keep us safe and create healthy relationships, whether that's to our own relationships, to the youth that we work with, or simply just educating youth overall about domestic violence and abuse, and trying to mirror healthy relationships. On the screen here, I have a healthy relationship quiz from our good friends, Love is Respect. And this is called the Is My Relationship Healthy quiz. And if you are currently in a relationship right now, or if you're just curious, I can leave it in the chat. Feel free to visit that link, take the quiz. We like it at our org. We emphasize healthy relationships all the time. And so if you would like to take that quiz, if you'd like to share this quiz with anybody that you know, feel free to do that. I think it's great. But a little quiz to kind of take, see if your relationship is healthy. Where does it fall under the relationship spectrum we talked about a little bit earlier? So healthy, unhealthy, abusive, and then what can you do to mirror your healthy relationships, but also get help and resources if you were to need them with unhealthy and abusive ones. Again, feel free to share that quiz. I think it's really, really good. And a lot of youths might like it. So with that, let's jump into part 3, centering youth and trauma-informed approaches. What does that look like? So trauma-informed approaches, if you are working with youth, if you know anybody in your life that is a young individual going through domestic violence or abuse, how do you approach it, right? We want to be able to offer resources. We want to be there. We want to do our part. But sometimes it's hard to talk about abuse. It's not easy to just bring up the topic of abuse. So how do we go at it? What is a trauma-informed approach? So there are everyday ways that we can kind of employ a trauma-informed lens and approach to our interactions with survivors. And on the screen, we have 6 key elements that can go into the approach. So trust, safety, collaboration, choice, empowerment, and compassion. Looking at these 6 components, can you share specific examples of how you could or already do kind of put these values into action and how you support or would support a survivor in your life? I would like to know. But yeah. And same question, again, what's one way you could put these values into action when supporting survivors in your life? Again, leave it in the chat if you would want to think about it out loud for a second here. Take some time to think about it. How can you implement this into your work, into your everyday life? Trust, safety, collaboration, choice, empowerment, compassion. And if you're thinking about it, what does it sound like? What can you say, especially if you've never really applied all of these things into your work before? Here on this slide is what a trauma-informed approach may look and sound like. So with trust, we have the braving, the vault. You don't share information or experiences that are not yours to share. right? Trying to build that trust. Don't go gossiping about somebody else's experiences with abuse, their pain. Um, letting this person know that they can really trust you with everything that's been going on involving abuse and domestic violence. Safety, so your emotional and physical safety is really important. How can I help you feel safe? Asking something like that can go a long way. Collaboration, so you said, um, the thing we said here is you set a goal of yours is to move into your own apartment in 2 months. What step can I support you to taking and achieving that goal? And we added this example up here as a form of collaboration, but it doesn't have to sound exactly like this. How would you collaborate with youths and young individuals in your life as an adult, as a mentor, as an educator? What would that look like? What would that sound like? And how that would tie into them being able to fully trust you. Choice. So finding opportunities to encourage survivors to make their own choices. They have the free will to do that, especially when you are coming from an abusive situation, abusive relationship. Your choices are oftentimes taken away, and you don't have the choice. You don't have that opportunity to make choices for yourself, even if it's just, choosing what to wear, choosing what to eat, choosing where to go, especially if you're in a relationship where you are being isolated, controlled, and just everything of the sort. A lot of times, letting the victim survivors and these youths make their own choices can go a long way. Empowerment, of course, so saying things like you deserve love, respect, connection, and healing. And then showing compassion, creating safe space for grace, having patience. Even if things are challenging or frustrating sometimes, it's okay to admit that out loud, right? Working in these fields, sometimes it can be very, very challenging, but having the patience, mistakes happens, and being understanding and extending non-judgment and consideration. All of this can kind of go into the trust category too. And once you kind of are able to showcase all of this, the trust between you and the victim survivor can grow, and you are able to then be able to talk to them a bit more about the situation that they're in, be able to offer resources if they were to need it. So how can we talk about abuse? Being honest, honesty, and developing appropriate language, avoid sweeping things under the rug, as they can just do more damage than good. And people know when talking with victim survivors, whether that's children, teens, adults, they know when somebody is very much trying to avoid the topic at hand, and they don't seem like they are able to help this individual. So being honest, um, using developmentally appropriate language, looking through, um, looking at it from an appropriate lens, asking questions and validating their answers, build trust and respect. Building trust and respect can tie us back into our previous slide, right? All of these can go into building trust and respect. Repeat that violence is never okay and that it's not their fault. And normalizing that we might not have all the answers. Sometimes, even as adults, as providers, it's okay to say, I don't know, that you don't know all the answers. But you don't want to stop there by simply saying you don't know the answers and stopping there. We want to be able to then offer resources to those who may know the answer or who may be able to take them a step further in their healing journey. So kind of just tips that we have for advocates and providers. Leaving doesn't guarantee safety, and talking with survivors about signs of stalking. Again, leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time for victim survivors, especially for youths who are young. This leads to homelessness, things can escalate. And so it doesn't guarantee somebody's safety. And we want to be able to provide them with resources if we can. Where can they go? Who can they talk to? Leaving doesn't guarantee healing. Takes a long time to build trust and heal from what's been going on. Documentation is essential, so help survivors keep track of threats, assaults, and stalking behaviors in order to better help them. Plan for safety. Safety planning, we do a lot of that here at Women's Advocates. If anybody is interested in our safety planning, I can definitely put you on. You can go to our YouTube again to see our safety planning webinars. We have a lot of that, and they're very, very helpful. And we have safety planning forums at Women's Advocates. If you'd like them, feel free to reach out to us. But yeah, plan for safety. Talk with survivors about how they'll respond in cases of specific incidents or threats. You know, be as specific as possible with them. This all ties into being honest, not sweeping things under the rug, not trying to make things awkward, being honest. Like if somebody were to break into your home, try to harm you in any way, what can we do? Who can you call? Where can you go to hide, to be safe? Stuff like that. So offering resources. And you know about us, women's advocates. So if you know any teens, youths, children, anybody at all who need our services and help, feel free to refer them to us now. If you are a youth provider, you work in your own org, please leave that in the chat. Leave where you are from the chat, what you do. We can bounce off one another and be able to offer more resources that way. And then on this slide, we want to avoid the victim blaming mindset and minimizing somebody's experiences with abuse. And instead, we want to center, validate, and be able to believe victim survivors and their stories. So just some quotes on the screen, right? What can you say instead of having a victim blaming mindset? You can say things like, your feelings are valid. I am here to listen. I believe you. Sometimes it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be super cheesy. It doesn't have to be anything of the sort. You don't need to go on this whole spiel. Sometimes people tell you their stories. You just have to tell them like, hey, I trust you. I believe you. And things that we don't want to say is provoking the victim survivors, things like, well, what did you do to deserve that? Are you sure that happened? Why didn't you just leave and get help? Why don't you just leave the relationship overall? Because we understand, right? And we know better than that it's hard to leave an abusive relationship, and there are various reasons as to why. So instead, we want to shift our mindset and be able to validate and help victim survivors, especially if they are young and impressionable, like youth. And this is something that we always want to do, is support holistic safety. So again, we talked about abuse going beyond just physical safety, right? We want to be able to focus on someone's emotional safety, intellectual safety, their spiritual safety, their financial safety, mental safety. And there are ways to do that, to hold difficult conversations, to be able to address these things, to understand why abuse happens and how abusive behaviors is a 24/7 pattern. So it's not just a one-time thing. Somebody tells you about a one-time incident where they were abused. You want to be able to be cautious and wary that there's a high possibility that that can happen again. And what you can do to help center and validate and help offer helpful resources to a lot of these youth and teens and children going through abuse. So we want to be able to contact elected officials in our communities in order to better help the youth around us, educate children. If you know anybody who would like to come to these webinars, who is a youth, who is younger, and can kind of benefit from our information today, whether that be this one or different ones. We have domestic violence 101s. We have, healthy relationship building blocks. If you know anybody who is interested and can benefit from that, send them our way. We would love to have them as part of our webinars, speaking out when we hear a lot of these victim blaming jokes. When we see youths who need help, children who need help, and they can't speak out for themselves, we want to be able to speak out and be able to help them. Supply businesses in our resources and neighborhoods. Again, you know about us, women's advocates. So if you know anybody who does need our help, feel free to send them our way. Show up and model healthy relationships to children's young people, because when they see that, it goes a long way, absolutely. And they are then able to model that for themselves as they get into relationships. And And that's exactly what we want for them, is healthy relationships. These are just some helpful links. Again, you will get the PDF slides to all of these at the end here. Bear with me a little bit. Some resources available, our contact information all on here. Feel free to reach out to us, our emails, our crisis line, let people know about us if they ever need our help. But yeah, we have reached the end of this webinar. Around now, I am going to copy and paste this link into the chat. Let me see if it works. Hopefully it works. If you can click on it, feel free to take this post-webinar survey for me as you close out. I'm sure you'll also get the link also, but today is Give to the Max Day. So if you would like, if you can, help us raise money for the victim survivors that we work with so we can keep doing our thing and do better around those the victim survivors who may need our help. And now that we are starting to kind of implement more youth work into our work, we want to be able to help youth find safe home, find safe resources, everything of the sort. So if you or anyone you know is able to help, that would be greatly appreciated. But here we are at the end. Feel free to scan the QR code on the screen if you just want the PDF slides straight to your phone. But thank you all so much for joining me today and listening to me talk about youth and domestic violence. Hopefully we all were able to learn something. Yeah, and thank you all for being here.